So my name is Kim Chakanetsa. I am a journalist and I'm also the author of Africana, which is a book about an encyclopedia about the African continent. And I was born and raised in Zimbabwe, but right now I'm based in London and I currently work for the BBC. I'm a radio journalist. I present a radio show called The Conversation and a BBC Africa podcast called The Cone. I think one of the problems is that a lot of the stories coming out of Africa are not told by people from Africa. And I think that really changes how things are told and seen because people don't usually have that insider knowledge. And so things can be told in a very simplistic way. And I think that gives rise to, sort of preconceptions and mistaken preconceptions. And I just think that when you're trying to tell an audience a story, there is always a temptation to keep it simple, because simple is easy. Simple is easy. Nuance and complexity are much harder work. And I think sometimes people don't give African stories that kind of time. So Africana is a chance to introduce this amazing continent to people who might not know it, or to deepen the knowledge for people who already know a lot about Africa. And it's just a way to give people a sense of the diversity, the flavor, the character of Africa as it is today. I think there are a lot of great books about Africa, but what I found is that there's very little that reflects contemporary Africa, Africa as it is now, especially for a younger audience. So we're not talking about, a historical Africa, we're talking about now. I mean, in the book we do look at history, but we also look at what's happening now, what's going to be happening in the future. So I thought the book would be a good way to cover that ground, which I feel is sort of not really covered. Yeah, in terms of messages, to just give people a sense of the diversity and the dynamism of this place, because I do think sometimes there are certain ideas about what the continent is, and just to give people a sense that no, it's many, many things. It's not just this one thing that sometimes people get stuck on. I think what's good now is that there's a sense that there's no one way to be African, and there's no kind of single African narrative. There's not a single story being told about Africa now, which is correct because we're made up of many, many countries, and each country has its distinct flavor, character, geography, people. And so I feel like now there's much less sort of saying African as in a kind of a group, just one big group. Like people speak about it like individual people, and I think that's really important. Like in the same way that people don't just say European, you'd be like the Spanish, the French. And I think Africa deserves that distinction, like to talk about, because I think that's part of the kind of curiosity and the kind of you give a place of respect when you kind of look at it a little bit more closely, as opposed to just sort of grouping things together. So I do think that the identity there's just much more kind of knowledge and awareness. It sounds silly, but I do think there's a real pride in being African. And I think the pride's been there for a while, but now I feel it's very heightened. And I think it helps when you have like people on the global scene. You have your Burna Boys, you have these big musicians doing big things. And before there was, I think, maybe a tendency to look west, or to look east, or to look anywhere but home. And I don't know if that's to do with travel, that you go to another country and you sort of, it helps you to appreciate what you have at home. It helps you to be like, so I've been here, but I can sort of now see some of like the stuff that perhaps I overlooked when I'm at home. We might seem really far apart in terms of, geographically. I think when people approach each other's cultures with curiosity and empathy, I think it makes us all richer. For me being here in Korea, I'm just sort of marveling at how things are similar and how things are different. And it makes me appreciate my own culture it makes me also really kind of appreciate your culture as well, like the fact that these worlds exist, and and I just think there's a tendency to be a bit fearful, especially at the moment, of other people, like, oh, you know, everyone's sort of pulling back, and like this is, I think there's so much that's lost when that happens. When everyone just, you know, I think when there's like a you know, meeting of cultures and exchange of ideas, the world's just a much better place. And I just think it's so important to kind of take an interest in other people's cultures, and to you know, to just be kind of open-minded and open-hearted. Do you know who I find really fascinating at the moment? I just think the creative industries, I think a lot of the artists are doing such great work. Music and art, I think, is such an important way of influencing people, right? I mean, think of what Hollywood's done and how much influence it's had. And so I think I'm very excited about like what music, you know, is doing. But even artists, I can think of, you know, some really good artists, whether they're doing sculpture or painting, and who are exhibiting around the world. And that really, really helps in literature as well. I mean, the amount of like writers who are coming up, and I think that for me is really a notable way of kind of like showing people, you know, just the breadth of talent on the continent. Make you more spark curiosity, and you want to learn more beyond, and you move beyond that one thing. And I'm hoping like music is that gateway, right? Or literature is that gateway, you know, culture is that gateway. And I think that's a really, really good thing. And it doesn't even need to be big gatekeepers, like, you know, it could be African sort of news organizations, but even just on social media, you have people, whether it's somebody on TikTok debunking, you know, people making fun of how people see Africa. That's all really important, because it's letting people who are from there tell their own stories and have a voice, and I think that's very, very important. What I would love is to see just a normalization a little bit of the way we tell our stories, in the sense that international organizations can, for example, hire Africans, right, to tell their stories, right? So you can have, I think, a story changes. If I am a Zimbabwean and I'm reporting on the Southern Africa region, the way I will tell that story will be very different to somebody who's not from there, right? So I'm not saying no one from there can, you know, should ever be hired, but I'm just telling you that there's real value in having somebody from there tell that story, because already they have that context, and hopefully they can bring that context and color into their reporting, and that changes things, right? And so I think that's really important. And I just think also, I'm hopeful, and I'm seeing it, Africans telling their own stories, like starting their own kind of, whether it's like a newsletter, whether it's like a YouTube channel, like it doesn't have to be a big fat media organization, you know? Like I think now media is much more fractured. People go to different things to get their news. You know, you might be on Twitter, you might go on YouTube, you might go on Facebook, you might go in different places, and I think there are different people doing different things. And as long as it's, obviously, what's really important, that it's correct, that it's not misinformation, and you know, I think that it's really good that we're hearing more voices and a diversity of plurality of voices, yeah. Being open-minded and open-hearted, like just in terms of how wanting to learn and not assuming that you have all the knowledge, and also I guess in the sense that also not overly romanticizing things, because that's also another risk. If things could be normal, you could realize that, you know, there's good, there's bad, there's, you know, in the same, just I guess being normal. I know that sounds really silly, but just not kind of being too much of one thing, just approaching things, you know, with just with kindness and generosity and open-heartedness, I think is the best way. Yeah. I don't know if I waffled with that one, but yeah, I think, yeah, I stand by that. Thank you, guys.